Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Pei Gimel. We are going to finish the 6th chapter and begin the 7th and begin a crazy set of stories about Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, if you remember, was in the cave with him. And from there, we're going to get to the famous story of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. That's the sneak preview to tomorrow. And with that, we will get started. And the stories are going to continue through Daf Pei. So we have a while of stories coming up. Really, it's going to start toward the end of today's daf. With that, we will get moving with our daf. Today's daf is sponsored by Max Shapiro in honor of his mother, Judy Shapiro. Your daf Yomi learning motivates me to continue doing so daily. Okay, we're going to get started with our sugya. We started with a Mishna yesterday about people carrying other people's barrels in the public domain. Or anywhere, it doesn't really matter, but they're moving someone's barrels and the barrels break. And the question is, right, is the person responsible or not? The Mishna rule very simply, doesn't matter whether you did it for free, doesn't matter if you get paid, you take an oath, and with that you exempt yourself. You say, what do you say in that oath? I didn't do it it wasn't pshia. Okay, what's pshia? It means I wasn't negligent about it. Someone asked me a good question yesterday. What's the difference between negligent and intentional? Right? In other words, negligent could be, I just wasn't careful enough, right? Whereas intentional is more, I didn't intend to break it. So we're going to talk about that. It's actually going to come up today. Here, it just seems like I didn't make a major mistake, which caused me to trip, that I was looking where I was going. It seems somewhere in between that, okay? Where negligence, pshia, doesn't necessarily mean I intended to break it, but it could mean I did something not the smartest thing. I wasn't very careful at all, careful like I should have been. Obviously, there's a range. There's not being careful at all. There's not being careful somewhat, being somewhat careful and not fully careful. It's somewhere in that range. It's not exactly 100% clear. So now that was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda had said, if you remember, it really depends on the level of shmirah you were doing or the level of your job. Were you getting paid to do this? Or were you not getting paid? If you're getting paid, you have more responsibility. And then you actually have to pay because it's just like gneva v'aveda, right? Because you tripped and fell, it got stolen from your house, it got lost. All of those things they're not exactly beyond your control, but they're also not intentional, or close to intentional, let's say. Then Rabbi Elazar said, we actually hold like Rabbi Meir, but I have some issues with it. And that's where we ended yesterday. But before we get to that, I want to remind you something else we did because we're going to come back to it. We had two things we're trying to resolve. One is Rabbi Meir seems to say in this sugya, if you trip and fall, you're not liable. You're not considered poshea, because poshea sounds like it's more intentional. Like you really wanted to commit, mess something up. Whereas in the sugya in Bava Kamma, we saw that Rabbi Meir holds you are considered a poshea, because exactly that's this question that someone had asked me, which is slipping and falling. Well, you're somewhat responsible, right? My dog ate my homework. Well, why did your dog eat your homework? Where'd you leave it? Why did you leave it out on the kitchen table and the water spilled all over it? That's not the smartest thing. Why did you leave your cup next to your computer full of water and it spilled over your computer? That wasn't the smartest thing. We can call you responsible for that, right? You bring in a computer to get fixed, and that's, and you say, oh, my water spilled on it. They're not going to say, oh, I understand it was an accident. No, what were you doing putting your water next to the computer? So nitkal is poshea, and you're liable. So that's really the problem here. Where do we put nitkal? What do we call that? So how do we resolve it? Rabbi Elazar says simply not the same Rabbi Elazar in the Breita, but Rabbi Elazar the Amar says simply two different approaches of what Rabbi Meir said. One appears in our Masechah, one appeared in Bava Kamma, and that's all there is to it. We're going to get back and answer in a different way in a few minutes. But now we're in the middle of the issues that Rabbi Elazar had with Rabbi Meir, or at least what the Gemara seems to be putting in his mouth and saying what the problems were. I'm not going to review the other two because we're actually going to review them again later in the Gemara, so we'll get back to it later. The third one we're up to, which is afilu b'mkom midron nami, starting at the top of our daf. We talked about yesterday, if it's a sloped area, then it's likely you're going to trip, and therefore it's not your fault if the barrel falls. But that's why it makes sense that you would take an oath and exempt yourself. But comes comes Rabbi, or at least we're putting this in Rabbi Elazar's mouth as to why Rabbi Elazar thinks there's an issue here. The whole issue is you're walking min komidron. You're carrying these barrels. Now, again, there's two possibilities. Either it just happened, it was an accident because you were bringing a heavy barrel down an incline, down a sloped area. It's not so easy. And it just slipped. It was a mistake. Or maybe you pushed it down the hill and said, oh, this would be fun, and let's see what happens. And you intentionally did it. We don't know really. And the whole idea is, well, you take an oath and that oath exempts you. But comes the Gemara to say, no, there's a problem with that. Because that would work if there were no witnesses to what happened. If there were witnesses that saw this happen, then you will not become exempt by taking an oath. The only way you can exempt yourself is by bringing the witnesses. And how do we know this? Tanya, Isi ben Yehuda, this is the opinion of Isi. Isi, the son of Yehuda, said. Now, we're talking about the psukim here. We're quoting from the Shomer Sachar. If you remember Shomer Sachar, it says in the psukim, you give someone something to watch. Nishbar o nishbar, mate o nishbar o nishbar. Some unexpected damages happens, in which case you'd be exempt. It says here, Shvuat Hashem tiye ben shnehem. So you take an oath, okay? But before it says Shvuat Hashem tiye ben shnehem, it says two words. Ein ro'eh. Nobody saw. Then it says you take an oath. So what does Isi ben Yehuda say? Ha-yesh ro'eh, yavi patil. The shvua is only in a case where nobody saw. But they come and say like this. If somebody saw, then you can't exempt yourself by an oath. The only way you can exempt yourself, like the oath, is only when we have no other choice. The only way you can do so basically he says, I don't know why you let them both take a shvua if there's proof. Now, obviously, if there's not proof, but if there is proof, and there's witnesses who could come and exempt you, then you have to bring witnesses. You can't exempt yourself with an oath. So that was the third problem he had with Rabbi Meir. Now we're going to go back to the contradiction, right? There's the problem with Rabbi Meir of how does he say both of them could take an oath? And that's one issue. The other issue was, doesn't this contradict what he says in Bava Kamma? So in terms of that contradiction, instead of saying there's two approaches to what Rabbi Meir holds, we're now back to the beginning, which is Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He gives a different explanation. He says that really the sugya in Bava Kamma is Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Meir really thinks you can't say, my dog ate my homework. Why'd you leave your homework out? That's your fault. Okay? The water spilled on your computer. That's your responsibility. But shvu'ah zo, but why in this case, when you're carrying someone's barrels from one place to the other, and they hired you, whether for money or for free, you are exempt if you trip and fall, or you let go of it and it breaks. Shvu'ah zo takanat chachamim. Really, you should be liable. But the rabbis came and said, if you take an oath, this wasn't intentional, or we're going to see exactly what the oath is, then you're exempt. Why? If we don't say this, we're going to have a problem in our society. It's a societal problem. Just like we have pruz ball, because if we don't have pruz ball, people are going to stop loaning money, because every time the Shemitah comes, it cancels the loan. Nobody's going to want to loan money. So same thing here. If we say you're liable, if you let go somehow, it breaks, you trip and fall, you're liable, no one's going to take this job. And then we're going to be stuck because not everybody can carry their barrels from place to place. We need to hire movers, right? If we make every mover responsible for accidents, then basically you're going to have no one who goes into that field, and that will create a problem in the society. And therefore, even though normally someone who trips is considered negligent, well, in this case, we're not going to consider you negligent just because of a tachanat chachamim. So comes the Gemara now and says, and this gets back to this question, what is negligence exactly? Heichi mishtaba, how do you take this oath? Amar Rava, shvu'ah shelo b'chavana shvartia. You say, I swear that I didn't break it on purpose. Okay? Because, in other words, what's the problem? The problem is if you swear it wasn't right, that you weren't, you can't say, I swore I'm not poshea, because that won't help you. Because even not poshea, you'd be responsible. So you have to say, it wasn't intentional. And it was an accident, but I wasn't intentional about my accident. Okay. I didn't purposely try to spill it on my computer, the water, right? So then say, as long as it wasn't intentional, then you're okay. Now, there's a bit of a strange section in the Gemara. It's going to be a total repeat word for word of what we said yesterday of the explanation of Rabbi Yehuda and the explanation of Rabbi Elazar. What they seem to be saying is just like within Rabbi, like if we look at the structure, Rabbi Elazar, the Amora, had brought that explanation of Rabbi Meir, break it. And he says this in, right, he says this there and this, right? There's two different opinions about what Rabbi Meir says. And then went on to explain Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar in the Breita. Likewise, here we have the second explanation, that here's a unique case. And then we go through again, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar. Why we do this, it's quite unclear because, right, it's really saying the same thing as before, and it's no different according to this interpretation that we just quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. But either which way, we're going to read it. And that's why I said we're going to review the three things that Rabbi Elazar had issue with. That's why I didn't start with them. So again, Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't just say everyone's exempt. We say it depends whether you got paid or not paid, because this fits into the general rules we have about a shomer chinam and a shomer sachal. And each one, right, this is like gneva v'aveda, because again, it's in between. You did something that caused it, but not directly, right? It wasn't really your fault, and therefore we're going to put it in the middle. But ata Rabbi Elazar lemeimar, in Gemara Rabbi Meir, really the tradition says that we hold like Rabbi Meir. However, but I'm not really sure why we allow them both to take oaths, meaning the shomer chinam and the shomer sachar. And now we're going to go through the three issues. So the shomer chinam says, I didn't do anything intentional about it, right? I didn't purposely break it. But what's the shomer sachar going to do? Because even if it wasn't with intent, it doesn't matter, you're still liable. Like in Neva Vaveda, it wasn't Pshia, and yet they were still liable. Even if it wasn't Pshia, they would have to pay. And even a shomer chinam, we get it if it fell down, if you're walking in a sloped area. But how can you possibly take an oath? I didn't make it wasn't my fault. I didn't do something wrong. When you're walking in a flat place, of course you did something wrong. There's no way to trip if it's a flat surface. And even if it was a slope place, that's only if there's no witnesses. But if there's a way to bring witnesses, then you have to bring witnesses, and you can't take an oath. How do we know this? Again, word for word, we're repeating where we started. Nobody saw. And that's when you take an oath. If someone did see, those are the three issues. Now, since we mentioned this Isi ben Yehuda, we're going to see a few cases where Rava paskin like Isi ben Yehuda. And there was a bit of a discussion between him and his son about it. Bava Kamma chavita dechamra beristika de mechosa. The first case is going to be just like ours. He was carrying a barrel of wine in the shuk of mechosa. And he bumped into one of these protrusions. The barrel knocked into it, okay, presumably by accident, and it broke. Until the Kamei de Rava, they went in front of Rava, both sides. The owner of the chavit, the barrel, wanted his money back. Rava said, listen, in mechosa, in the shuk there's lots of people. Somebody must have seen it. In which case, bring proof, and then you'll be exempt. But without a proof, I'm not going to let you take an oath and say, I swear it was an accident. Amarle Rav Yosef Beres, or Rav Yosef, Rava's son, comes and says to him, Kiman, ki isi, what? You're holding like isi? Amarle im ki isi usvira lan kavate. Yes, exactly, you're right. I hold, like, this is isi's position, and I hold like isi. Another story, same structure, but a different story. Halu Gavra. It could be, by the way, that these are just two versions of the same story, because it's a little strange that Rav Yosef would ask the same question twice to his father, but perhaps it's two versions. It has to do with wine also, but it's a bit different. I sent you, let's say, okay, it was you in the story. I sent you to buy me 400 jugs of wine. You go, you buy them for me. When you bring me the wine, I say, you bought for me 400 jugs of wine, or sorry, you say, listen, Michelle, I bought you the 400 jugs of wine like you wanted, but they spoiled in the meantime. In other words, I bought them, you say they were good. I did my job properly, but then they spoiled after. So I now end up with these 400 jugs of spoiled wine. Obviously, I'm going to take this to a judge. Ata l'kamei de Rava. I brought it before Rava. I gave you money for 400 jugs of wine. I got 400 jugs of vinegar. I want you to remember this because we're going to come back later in a story. They're going to call someone vinegar, the son of wine. Okay, the vinegar wine theme is going to come up, even though it is in the next chapter, but it's still on the same page. Comes before Rava. Amrle arba me'adani chamar tkife kala itle lemilta. Rava says that when 400 jugs of wine go bad, people know about it. In which case, we will be able to find witnesses about when these jugs turn bad. It's a little interesting to think that people would know that, but somehow he thinks that's a big news item, something people would know about, and therefore bring proof that it happened after you bought them for me. If it happened before you bought them, then you ended up buying for me with my money 400 jugs of spoiled wine. That's obviously your fault. But if you bought them and they were good and they went bad in your possession, then you're off the hook. So zil aitiraya demi ikara ki zavin lehu chamra ma'al yahava. Bring proof that the wine was good when you bought it, the ipater, and then you'll be exempt. Amar le Rav Yosef Berei. Rav Yosef's son says again, keman ki isi, what, like isi? To which he answers, Amar le in ki isi usviru lan kavate. Yes, I hold like isi, and that's how I paskin. Again, it's weird that his son would have asked that twice, so it could be just two different versions of the same story. Now we're going to have one other halacha here, and then we're going to get to one last story, and with that, we'll finish the chapter. Itkin Rav Chiya bar Yosef b'sichra, hanu didare be'igra ve'itbar, nishalem pald. This is different ways of carrying things. Okay, we're going to have someone who took it on this pole, okay, like was carrying something on a big pole, and it broke. You have to pay half. Now, what's the issue here? My timer. Now we're going to learn a bit more about this. Agra. Nefesh l'chad v'zutar l'trei. What carrying on this pole is something that he carried something that was a little heavier than usual, but not exactly something that you usually have two people carry. Okay, you imagine those poles, like whatever you see, the spies, and that image of the spies that used years ago in the tourist industry about people carrying these heavy fruits, about these two poles and people carrying things on the poles. That's something that clearly two people carry. But here we're talking about a pole that could be one person, but you carry something a little bit too heavy for one, but it's not exactly something that you would have two for. So the guy thought it was not a problem, but then it broke, and the pole broke. It was too heavy for the pole, and it broke. Whatever you were carrying broke on the floor. So basically, we're going to make you half responsible because it wasn't exactly something you would use two people for, and it was reasonable for you to think you could carry it by yourself, and therefore we're going to put it in the middle here. But we're going to call it karov la'ones v'karov l'pshia. It's sort of close to not your fault. It's sort of close to being negligent. It's in between, and that's what we're going to make you pay half. But bedigla, but if it's with this kind of fork-like thing that people would use, always two people would carry it, then mishalim kula. Then you have to pay the full damages because you should have had two people carry it and not one. So you shouldn't have said, oh, I'll carry this myself. I assume what happened here is that someone gave you money to carry this, and you were supposed to kind of bring someone else with you and share the cost. And you were just trying to say, oh, I'll take all the money for myself, right? It's a good question. Like, what was the arrangement and how much were you getting paid and all that? They don't seem to go into that. Now we get to a story. Rabbi Bar Hanan. So the story is about him. Some people who we're going to see were very poor people carried his barrel of wine. And according to Rashi, it makes sense with the story, they were poshea. They were irresponsible and caused, again, what that is exactly, how negligent, but they seem to have caused the damage to the barrels in a way that would make them responsible. What happened? They had no money. So Shakil Galimayu, he took their cloak, said, I'll seize your cloak. Very, it's my solution. Atu Amr the Rav. They go to Rav and they say, what happened? This guy took our clothes. Amr le hav le glimayu, lahav lehu glimayu. Give them back their clothing. Amar le dina hachi says, what? Is that the law? What do you mean? They were pushim. They broke my barrels. I don't have to give them back their clothes. They owe me money. They didn't have money. I took their clothes. Amar le'im. He says, yes, this is in fact the ruling, Rav says. Leman telech b'derech tovim. And a fascinating way to end this chapter, and we've seen this topic a number of times already, which is you have to go in the way of the righteous. Okay, we're going to get back to this tovim and rishaim and all that in a bit. Meaning, lifnim mishurat hadin. You have to go beyond the letter of the law. Yes, it's true. They might have been intentional about this, but they're poor people and you should be nice to them, and I want you to let it go. They have money to pay you. Don't take their clothes. That's just, right? It's just not nice. And you're a Talmid Chacham, you should hold yourself to a higher standard possibly. And therefore, Yav Lehu Glimayu. So he listens to Rav and he gives them back their clothes. Now, remember, he hired them for a job. They did the job, but they were bad about the job. They messed it up. And in the end, the job wasn't done. So obviously he didn't pay them. Well, they saw they won in judgment. They say, Amre Lehu, Amrele. So they say to the rabbi, Ani Ananya, we're poor, but we worked all day. Now, it's true, we didn't get the job done, but we worked all day. V'kafinan v'leit lamidi, and we're hungry and we don't have anything to eat. Amar le, he says to Rabbi Bar Hanan, have zil havi grayu, go pay them. Amar le, dina hachi, is this the law? I have to pay these guys? They didn't even do the job. Not only, right, do I not get reimbursed for my wine, but now I have to go pay them? Amar le'in, yes, and he quotes the end of that pasuk. It's a pasuk in Mishle. Ve'orchot tzadikim tishmor. Ways of tzadikim, the righteous people you should keep, and you're a righteous person, and therefore hold yourself to a different standard, and you should in fact pay. You should not only that, pay them for the work they did, so they have food to eat. And with that, Hadran hasocher ta'umnim. So even though we discuss all these halachot of who's right and who's wrong and who needs to get paid for workers and when do they not get paid, we end with, sometimes you got to just go beyond the letter of the law and pay people even if they're not deserving of it. And that's a court ruling, which is also interesting. We've talked about this before, that sometimes the lifnim mishurat hadin is the din. The law is you have to do beyond the letter of the law. Okay, with that, we'll start our next chapter. Now, in general, the work days was from sunrise to sunset. Could be even Seder Kochavim. Okay, well, there's different approaches here, whether it's, when 3 stars come out or whether it's at what we call sunset. So you hire workers and you insist they work earlier than normal or later than normal. If you live in a place where nobody does that, or that's the general accepted practice is to work only from sunrise to sunset, let's say, then you can't insist that they work longer. The Gemara is going to say this is totally obvious. Why are you telling us this? Right? This obviously also means that you hire them without specifying how many hours they were working. You didn't specify that you wanted them to work extra hours, and then you come later and you say, what do you mean? I meant for you to work those hours. You obviously can't insist. The Gemara is going to say this is totally obvious. Why would you be telling us this? Makom shenagu lazun yazun. If people pay workers, they give them meals, then you have to give them meals. The main topic of this Mishna is minag hamakom determines, okay, what the custom in the land is. L'sapek b'mitika yisapek. If they just give sweets, or some people think like dips for their bread or something, then that's all you have to do. Hakol k'minhag hamedina. All just depends on what the custom is. Now we quote something that we quoted already on Daf Mem Tet, but here it is in the Mishnah itself. Right there, it was quoted from our Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Metzia, Shamar lebenot seve'sfor lanu poalim. He asked his son to go hire workers. Halachu pasak lemizonot. So the son went and said, "We'll give you food." Kishavai Tel Aviv. When he got back to his father and told him what happened, Amar lo beni, if I now give them, or you give them the biggest, nicest meal, like a king's meal for Shlomo HaMelech, even that won't be good enough for them. They could still claim we owe them more. Why? Shehem b'nei Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and you didn't specify. They could say, we want the most lavish meal in the world, even more lavish than Shlomo HaMelech, because they're the sons of Avram, Isaac and Yaakov and Jacob, and therefore they're deserving of the best of the best. Make sure you get to them before they start working and say to them, I only meant bread and legumes. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer lo היה צריך לומר הכל כמנהג המדינה. I don't know why he went so far to do this. He really didn't need to, because it all just goes by what the custom of the land is. If you promise them food, it's whatever food people normally give. You never would have had to give them a meal more lavish than Shlomo HaMelech. What employer does that for their workers? So now the Gemara starts off with this pshita. Isn't it totally obvious that you can't make them work overtime without having stipulated so from the beginning? To which it says, lo tzricha, and this is a theme we saw already in the previous chapter, titfa lehu aigrayu. Well, maybe you added more. You paid them instead of 30 shekels an hour for 10 hours, you paid them 30 shekels an hour for 12 hours. And you meant that they would work extra hours and you paid them extra. You might have thought, you could say, Amar lehu, haditfai lehu aigraichu, adate de makadmitu machashchitu badai. I added 2 more hours so that you will work 2 more hours. Wasn't that obvious? Kamashmana, therefore, it comes to teach you, da'amri, they know, where they could say, we thought you were just paying us more per hour. And we just thought that meant we have to do better quality work, but quality and not quantity. So therefore, they have the upper hand and they can claim that, and he can't insist, the employer can't insist that they work the extra hours. Amar Rish Lakish, turning now to Amabed. Here's a good question. Do your travel hours, are they considered, if you work 8 hours a day and it takes you an hour to get to work, is that part of your 8 hours a day or not? So po'el b'knisato mishalo, we're going to have an interesting answer here. When you go home, knisato means when you come in, meaning go into your house, right? You would have thought knisato is into work, but no. When you go home at night, mishalo, it's on your cheshbon, meaning you have to leave work at the very end of the workday. And then travel time is on your time. B'yetziato, but when you go out in the morning, mishal balabayit. In the morning hours, they pay, meaning you leave your house at sunrise and then you travel to work. Interesting. It's like a split here, right? Where do we get this from? Oh, we're going to find a pasuk in Tehillim. And from here, we're going to get to another pasuk in Tehillim, which appears 2 pasukim before that, and get off on a total tangent. Shneimah, tizrach hashemesh ya'asefun, ve'el ma'onotam yirbatzun. Okay, this is in Barchi Nafshi. Yitzeh adam lefo'alo, here comes, okay, this, I'll just translate. The sun will rise and you will gather, and el ma'onotam yirbatzun, and then they'll go into their abodes. Yitzeh adam lefo'alo, a person will go out to his job, to his work. Ula avatato adei arav. So when the sun rises, a person will leave for work. That's where we get it. Leave for work at sunrise. That means travel time is for the work, the worker gets paid for it. But the avodato, when do you finish your work? Adei arav, in the evening. And then you work until evening, meaning you only go home when you're done working when the evening hits. So that means your travel time in the day, at the end of the day, is on your time. To which they say, I don't understand why you're learning this from a pasuk. But why don't you just do it based on minhag hamakom, whatever the custom is in the land? Well, be'ir chadasha, we're talking about this would be the law in a new city that doesn't yet have a minhag hamakom. Okay, this whole sugya is going to sound, this next section, of the way it was in Israel. Like, what's the minhag when people came from all over, right? So in the beginning, they say, oh, it was a new city. But then the Gemara says, but usually new city, it's all people from the same place, right? This also happened when people came to Israel. They would all, come from one area and settle in an area together. So they would just obviously keep up their old customs. So you don't need this for that. Binikotai. So they answer, it's a place where you ended up with a potpourri of people from all different places, and therefore there's no set custom, and then you would rely on this pasuk. Otherwise, pasuk, no pasuk, right? We rely on the custom of the land. Because again, this is all a matter of what we assume the arrangement is, and this is obviously all in a case where we didn't make an arrangement. If we put it in the contract about your travel time, then obviously we're going to go by the contract. But in the absence of contract, we go by minhag hamakom. In the absence of minhag hamakom, we go by this pasuk. Or, well, it also could be in a case where you hired someone and said, we're going to go by a poel according to the Torah. Now, this isn't exactly Torah, it's Delim, but, it meant by Tanakh, and what it says in the Torah about this. And if you specify that in the contract or in your verbal agreement, then we will revert to this pasuk, even if it goes against the custom, because that's what you stipulated. Darish Rabbi Zera, Va'amr Leitana Rabbi Yosef. Okay, either Rabbi Yosef brought a bright about this or Rabbi Zera said this. My dichtiv, and this is two psukim earlier. Tashet choshech v'yihi laila, bo tirmos kol chayato ya. Tashet choshech v'yihi laila. This means, right, it became dark and it was night. Zeh ha'olam hazeh shedomeh laila. This is this world, which is like the nighttime, because nighttime is usually bad, right? This world compared to the next world, the world to come, is obviously darkness compared to light. Bo tirmos kol chayato ya. What are the animals in the forest? Elo rishaim. Shebo domim l'chaya shebiyar. What does a chaya in the forest do? Hides. Rishaim hide. They lurk. They hide. And then, right, so in Laila, in this world, we have all these rishaim. Tizrach hashemesh yasefun ve'elma onotam yirbitzun. Well, Tizrach hashemesh, when the sun rises, which is an allusion to Olam Haban, the world to come, Latzadikim, it will be for the righteous people. Yasfun, who will be collected, La Rishaim leGehenom. The Rishaim will all be gathered and they'll be sent to Gehenom, to hell. Ve'elma onotam yirbitzun, ein lecha kol tzadik v'tzadik she'en lo mador lefi chvodo. Each will go into their place. Each tzadik will have his own, her own place in Shamayim, okay, in the world to come, according to their level of respect they're deserving of. Now we're getting to the pasuk that we saw before. Yetzei adam lefoalo, yetzu tzadikim lekabel scharan. So what's going to be the foalo in the world to come? The tzadikim will go out to get their rewards for all the work they did. What work? L'avodato adei areth. B'mishi shlim avodato adei areth. It's for those who completed their work when they were in Olam Hazeh. So when in this world, if they completed their work, they always did good things, then they will get rewarded in the world to come. So this pasuk is coming to talk about Rishaim and Tzadikim, everyone getting what they're deserving of, which we know doesn't always hold true. And maybe that's going to be the immediate reaction to this by seeing this next story and the complications of this and who's in charge of this, and keep that theme in your head. A lot of the ideas of the analysis of this story I took from an article that I read. I forgot to write who wrote it, but tomorrow we're going to continue with it anyway. So tomorrow I'll mention the reference and who wrote this article that I was reading. So now we're going to have one of these great stories, and a little less known than the Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan story that we're going to get to tomorrow, but no less interesting and maybe even perhaps more interesting. And we'll try to talk about, and something also that this woman did in this article I was reading, is to connect between the ideas in both the stories, put them together. So we have a few days of going through these stories. As we go on, we'll analyze them. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Eshkach lahu parhagvana de katafis ganavi. He meets this person who's a policeman who's basically in charge of capturing thieves. Amar li, how do you know? How do you find these people? Lav metile. They're not like chayot. They're not like animals. And what did we learn about animals? Dichtiv bo termos kol chayato ya'al. Right? It says that all the chayot yar are basically, they're in the forest and they hide. So how do you know? What he's basically asking is, how do you know who you're catching is really the thief? And you're not catching people who aren't thieves. This, by the way, goes on all the time, right? So here, we'll hold up for 1 minute and we'll see. Some people say Mehai Krak Amr. He was getting it from a different pasuk, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. They're hanging out and hiding like a lion in his lair. Dilma shakel tzadike v'shavka rashia. Maybe you're taking tzadikim instead, and you're sending them to the authorities, and you're leaving rishaim. So Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon is saying, this isn't a great job you're dealing with because you could make a lot of mistakes. Amarle umay avid harmana demalku. What am I going to do? This is king's order. Okay, and this sounds like, there's certain places where sometimes you just have to, the king needs people arrested. Doesn't matter who, your job is arrest people. You don't care. I mean, you try your best, but you make mistakes. You're doing what your job is, which is to arrest people. Like some terrible incident happens, someone's got to take the blame for it. So you take someone, even if they're not necessarily responsible. Now, it seems to be also the problem is that they were handing over Jews to the Gentile authorities. And that was really a problem because Gentile authorities would likely kill them. And then, who are you to decide, like, who are you to play God, basically? So Amar, but Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon asked this question for a reason, because Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon had an answer to this question. He said, I have a way. You're not sure, and you say you're stuck because the king insists you do this. Remember this term harmana de malku, because someone else is going to say it later. Amar ta egmarcha hechitiavid. I think it's not in today's stuff. I think it's in tomorrow's, but keep it in mind. So he says, I'll tell you how to do it. I have a solution. I want you to think, is this a good solution? Is this really a foolproof way to figure out who's really a thief? Going to the restaurant or the pub, the place where people are eating at 4 hours into the day. If you remember from brachot, right, the workers eat at 4 hours into the day. Okay, well, remember, we're talking about workers here, although Talmidei Chachamim, if you remember, eat at 6 hours into the day, which is like midday, 12 o'clock. 4 hours into the day is 10. But it seems also maybe there was some Talmidei Chachamim eating here. We'll see that in a minute. It's the main time when people ate. And then you look around. We see people that are drinking wine, and they have a cup in their hand, and they fall asleep. Okay? They fall asleep as they're eating. Check out what they do with their lives. If they're a Talmid Chacham who falls asleep, he must have woken up early to study, and that's why he's tired at 10 o'clock. If he's a worker, this also connects with our sugya, he must have gotten up early to work. Okay, maybe he's at one of those jobs that starts before. If he's a night worker, redude radid, okay, which is the Rashi explains what they would do at night. Some people would play with I don't know, pull or something, strands of metals, okay, of copper. And it was something that was a quiet job, so you could do it at night. Like imagine a silversmith trying to work at night, they make all that noise. But they would hear lengthening metal wires, okay, something like that. It was a job people would do at night. Okay, no problem. We understand why they're tired. But elo, if it's not this or that or that or the other, then you must assume, what are they doing up at night if not robbing people's houses? Because that's where robbers are at. So therefore, ganvahu vitafse, and then catch that guy and bring him in. It's a bit of a strange way of testing who's a thief or not, right? Process of elimination, and what if there was some other reason the person was tired? Ishtama milta bemalka. So the king heard, okay, this got all the way back to the king. The guy comes up with this new method based on what Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. They said, how'd you come up with this method? And he tells them, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon told me. To which they turn to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, the king's people. Amru, karyana di igarta iu lehave parvanka. It's a good thing to remember this term. The guy who reads the letter, he should be the messenger to do what it says in the letter. You suggested this? Great. What better person to implement this procedure than you? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, we need you. You're going to work for us right now. He doesn't actually seem to, okay, I want to point out, this also she points out in the article, doesn't seem to be upset with this job, kind of likes it. So they put him in charge, and he starts catching ganavim. You remember, he was this very fanatic kind of guy also. Everything was black and white. When he comes out of the cave, if you remember the story, right? It's a good job for a guy like this. So now what happens? So this becomes his job. Okay, first of all, he probably has to leave the Beit Midrash for this also, and this becomes his job, catching bad people. Shalach le Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, who we're going to see later in the story, was his teacher. He says to him, Chometz ben Yayin, I promise we will get to this, vinegar, son of wine, right? Your father is wine. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is fabulous. You're spoiled. You've taken his way and ruined it. We're going to come back to this word in the next story also. What are you sending Jews to get killed? Who are you to send the nation of God, to people from the nation of God to get killed? Right? This is basically saying, you're turning over people to the Gentile authorities and they're murdering Jews. Well, instead of saying Harmana Damalkahu, which the other guy said, notice he doesn't say, I have no choice, the king told me, which shows that he obviously doesn't mind this job. Shalach le, he's almost saying, I'm doing the work of God. He says, Kotzim ani mechaleh min hakeren. I'm taking thorns out of the vineyard. I'm uprooting evil from the community. I'm identifying all the evil people and I'm sending them to their death. What better job to do than that, right? Maybe that's why he wasn't upset about leaving the Beit Midrash. This is really important work. Shalach le, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Korcha sends back to him, Yavo ba lakerem v'yichlet kotzav. A fabulous line. The person whose vineyard it is should be the one to get rid of the thorns. This is God's job. Who are you to play God? What do you think? Now, what's really interesting is that we were talking before about that tzaddikim will get what's done, right? And we all know that and almost the question Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon is relating to in the beginning is, how do you know the difference between a tzaddik and a rasha? And, we look at the world, we always complain, there's someone who looks righteous and yet they're suffering. There's evil people that are having a good life. And that's a question that seems to be underlying this story. And basically what we're saying is, you are not the one to judge who's a tzaddik, who's a rasha. You don't know. You really don't know. And therefore, and if you think you know, it doesn't matter. That's not your role in this world. That's God's role. And that seems to be the bottom line of this story. And you would have thought the story would end and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon would accept this and move on and go back to the Beit Midrash. But that's not what happens. Apparently, he continued doing this. Yom echad, pagabahu koves. He bumps into a launderer. Karyeh chometz ben yayin. And the launderer screams at Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and calls him vinegar, the son of wine. Okay, he probably got a bad reputation in the town for basically uprooting all these evil people, and this guy starts cursing him. Well, that pissed off Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Amar midachatziv kulei hai shma mina rishiyahu. Well, this guy is really chutzpahdik. He must be a rasha. Now, notice all of a sudden he switches tactics. This isn't the way he normally identified rishaim. He now has a new way of identifying rishaim. Oh, you're chutzpahdik? Okay, you have audacity. You call me a chometz ben yayin. You must be an evil person. Amar lehu tafsuhu and tafsuhu. So he says to the Gentile authorities, catch this guy. He's obviously a bad person. They grabbed him. Libatar dinach nadate. But once he calmed down and wasn't so angry anymore from the incident, aza batre lepiruke. He went to redeem this guy. He realized that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Now here it's interesting, right? He picked a different method, realized it's a mistake. Vilomate, but it was too late. The Gentiles wouldn't let the guy go. Kare ale. Now, his immediate reaction is an interesting one, although maybe somewhat expected. Shomer pivu lishono, shomer mitzarot nafsho. Someone who watches his mouth, keeps his mouth shut or her mouth shut, protects themselves from future problems. So what he really seems to be saying is, this guy opened his mouth and cursed me. Well, I guess that's what caused his downfall, kind of pushing the blame on the other guy. Although if you think about it, it's a critique on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai himself, because he was the one, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon himself. He was the one who opened his mouth in the beginning and said, I have a way to do this. And from that ended up being put in this job, which led him to this place, which led him to basically getting this guy taken by the Gentiles. And not only that, but the next thing that happens is, Sikafuhu, they hang the guy and kill him. At this point, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon feels awful and blames himself and starts crying. Amrule, Rebbe, now all of a sudden you see the first time they call him Rebbe in this story, okay? Rebbe, as opposed to calling him chometz ben yayin, they all of a sudden have some respect for him, I guess because he starts to cry and show a little bit of understanding that he did something wrong. Al yerabe enecha, don't be upset about this. Shehu beno ba'aluna ram urasa b'yom kippurim. He and his son slept with a betrothed woman on Yom Kippur, as if like no worse thing than that. And they were deserving of death. Okay, they were deserving of skila and the soklim. They would end up hanging them after they did that, and that's what happened to him. So he got what he was deserving of. But this wasn't satisfactory enough for Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, because still it shouldn't have been him to kill them or to get him killed. Oh, so first he felt a little better. Sorry, he felt a little better right now. He puts his hand on his innards. Amar sisu b'nei ma'ai. Sisu, you should be happy because here I wasn't even sure of myself, and look, I was right. All the ones I was sure about that they were bad people, and I turned them in, I must have been right about it. So all of a sudden he feels vindicated. Wow, this is a sign from God. I must be doing the right thing. I'm sure that no worms will get into my innards. This is like bad people. They would get kind of eaten up from inside. Now I know I'm a good person and I've done the right thing. But and we're going to see this throughout the story, he still wasn't really sure. So what does he do? He goes in for surgery. Okay, here's an interesting description of surgery. They gave him a drink to make him fall asleep. They put him in a marble room. Karu, like I guess like a sterile kind of place. Karu l'krese, they opened up his stomach. Habu mafkimine dikule detar, but they took out tons and tons of fat. We're going to see tomorrow he was really overweight. Umot ve'b'shimsha b'tamuz va'av v'lo misrachem. They put him out. They put the fat out in the summer months, heat of the summer, and it didn't rot. And what do you see here? The innards of him didn't rot. That was a sign. This was like a way of checking. Am I right or not? Interesting way of checking. You see, we keep having these methods of testing things, which seem a little bit strange. To which the Gemara says, yeah, this doesn't even make sense because kol tarbanami lo sarich, fat never rots. That it wouldn't rot anyway. So it's not a test of anything. Kol tarba lo sarich, but shuraiki sumake masrich. But the red veins in the fat were also taken out, and those would rot. And here it didn't. So he said about himself, my flesh will live forever. And this he took as a sign that all is good. We're going to stop here. Both the story stops, and we're going to take a break in the story. We're only going to get back to the story of Peidal and Amabed, and we're going to get into other stories, and then we're going to try to bring everything full circle and make some sense out of all this crazy story. So right now we're going to just quick review. We started off with these three opinions about what to do with someone who breaks a barrel, and we had two different resolutions to the contradiction between Rabbi Meir and Bava Kamma and Rabbi Meir. Here we had three explanations why Rabbi Elazar took issue with Rabbi Meir. The third was Isi ben Yehuda, so we saw some stories where they held like Isi ben Yehuda that if there's a proof, you have to bring a proof, and taking an oath will not help you at all. And then we ended with that last section about Lifnei Mishurat Hadin. From there, we went into minhag hamakom and all sorts of things and arrangements with workers and how much what's typical in the society comes into play, whether it's food, whether it's work hours, whether it's travel time. But then we saw this travel time thing about if there's no minhag hamakom, then we go by what it says in this pasuk. And from there, we got into this pasuk and a drasha. And that pasuk about the tzadikim rishaim, which led us to the story of Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who was trying to uproot rishaim from within the community. Was he right or was he wrong? We're still kind of, clearly we feel a little pulled to saying this is not the right way to do things. And certainly Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha thought so. But Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon was pretty clear in his convictions. And we'll see how the story plays itself out. So yeah, we're not at the end yet, so don't worry about it. We still have more to go, and we will see you tomorrow.